January 22nd, 1943. The temperature is 20 degrees below zero. Inside the open cockpit of a Polikarpov Po-2, the wind doesn't just cut, it suffocates. The pilot, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, is 21 years old. Her navigator, Katya Ryabova, is 20. They are flying without a radio. They are flying without parachutes. Their only protection from the freezing air is a thick layer of grease on their faces and the goggles that are already frosting over. Below them, a German forward airbase sleeps, a dark smudge against the snow. Popova glances at her navigator. Katya taps her map, then points down sharply. This is the target. Popova nods. She reaches forward, pulls the throttle back, and kills the engine. The sudden, violent silence is terrifying. The roar of the 110-horsepower engine is gone. It is replaced by a sound, the eerie whistling whisper of the frozen wind moving over the aircraft's plywood wings, a sound like a broomstick sweeping the night sky. On the ground, a German sentry looks up, confused. He heard something, a whistling. He peers into the total darkness. He hears nothing. He doesn't know that the first plane is now directly above him, gliding in total silence. In the cockpit, Katya leans over the side. Her hands in their thick gloves grip a 50-kilogram munition. She calculates the wind, the glide path, and lets it go. Popova shoves the stick forward into a dive, forcing the engine to restart with a deafening, percussive roar. The explosion, the roar of the engine, and the panic of the German searchlights all happen at the instant the plywood coffin disappears into the darkness, just as the second plane in her squadron begins its silent glide. How did this happen? How did a 1928 biplane, made of wood and fabric and slower than a World War I fighter, become the most terrifying psychological weapon on the Eastern Front? And who were these women, these girls that the most advanced military in the world came to fear and to name the Night Witches? To understand the legend of the Night Witches, you must first understand the world that created them, a world where their very existence was a mathematical impossibility. The year is 1941. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, is the single most terrifying and effective military force on the planet. Its air arm, the Luftwaffe, is a high-tech marvel. It is a force built on the cold, hard logic of industrial power. It is a world of metal, speed, and precision, of Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the Ferrari of the skies, dueling at 400 miles per hour. It is a world of complex radar, powerful engines, and devastating cannons. And above all, it is a world of men. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, this machine hit the Soviet Union with a force that almost shattered the nation. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, was decimated. In the first day alone, over 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them before they ever left the ground. The German logic was, as always, flawless. Their pilots were veterans of Spain and the Battle of Britain. Their planes were superior. Their tactics were revolutionary. The Soviet response was chaos. In this brutal, masculine world, the role of women was clearly defined and universally understood. Women were nurses, tending to the wounded. They were factory workers, building the tanks and planes. They were victims. They were refugees. They were the home front. They were, by every military doctrine in the world, German, British, American, or Soviet, forbidden from the act of combat. They were not to fly the planes. They were not to pull the trigger. This was the old reality. This was the logic. And then that logic was broken. It was broken not by a general or a politician, but by a single determined woman. Her name was Marina Raskova. To Americans, she was the Soviet Amelia Earhart. To the Soviet people, she was a legend. She was a national hero, a celebrity pilot who, in the 1930s, had set multiple world records for long-distance flight. In 1938, she and two other women had completed a record-breaking 3,600-mile flight across Siberia, becoming international superstars. They were the poster children of Soviet modernity. Crucially, Marina Raskova had something that no general possessed: personal, direct access to Joseph Stalin. As the German army closed in on Moscow in the fall of 1941, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Raskova used that access. She was flooded with thousands of letters from young women across the country. These were not letters of panic, they were letters of rage. They were from the girls of the Osoaviakum, the civilian aero clubs. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union had gone crazy for aviation, and thousands of young women had learned to fly, to navigate, and to jump with parachutes. They were trained pilots, and now their country was being destroyed. Their letters all said the same thing: "We want to fight. Let us fly. We are pilots." One letter from a student named Yevgenia Redneva simply said, "I know the front needs navigators. I am ready. Send me." Raskova took these letters and went directly to Stalin. She bypassed the entire military chain of command, the old bearded generals who had told her it was impossible. She did not ask Stalin to let women join male regiments. She proposed something far radical, something unthinkable. She asked for the creation of all-female combat aviation regiments, not just pilots, but navigators, mechanics, armorers, and commanders. 3 complete segregated female units. No nation in the world had ever done this. It was military heresy. Stalin's logic, however, was not the logic of a traditional military man. It was the logic of a dictator in desperate trouble. He was not winning. He was losing. He was losing thousands of planes and tens of thousands of men. His back was against the wall. He looked at Raskova, a woman the entire nation adored, and he saw a resource he had not yet used. He saw a propaganda victory. He saw, perhaps, a new, untapped source of human will. On October 8, 1941, he signed Order Number 0099. It authorized the creation of the 122nd Aviation Group, consisting of 3 all-female regiments. The military world was stunned. The male generals were appalled, but the order was given. Marina Raskova became the commander, and the call went out. This is where the story truly begins. The applicants were not soldiers. They were girls. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. They were university students from Moscow, factory workers from the Urals, farm girls who had dreamed of the sky. Yekaterina Ryabova, a 20-year-old student, was studying mechanics at Moscow University. She secretly applied. When she was accepted, her father, a simple man, packed her bag and said only, "Don't bring shame on us." Nadezhda Popova, the daughter of a railway worker, was already a civilian flight instructor at 18. She was a tiny, vivacious woman who had been turned away from the recruiting office. When she heard Raskova's call, she was one of the first to arrive. They gathered at a small, miserable airfield in the town of Engels, and here they met the old reality head-on. The male commanders who were assigned to train them were openly contemptuous. They called them devchonki, little girls. This was not a term of endearment, it was a slur. They gave them uniforms designed for 200-pound men. The women had to tear them apart and re-sew them, stuffing their massive size 12 boots with newspaper and rags so they wouldn't fall off. The helmets were too big. The flight goggles wouldn't stay on. Their underwear was military issue and male. Everything, from the very beginning, told them they did not belong. This was the logic of the male military world pushing back. And then came the final, defining insult. The insult that would, by a perfect twist of historical irony, become their single greatest weapon. The other two female regiments, the ones destined to be fighter and bomber pilots, were given new, modern aircraft. The 586th got the fast metal Yak-1 fighter. The 587th got the advanced P-2 dive bomber. But the 588th Regiment, the one destined for night harassment, was given the leftovers. They were given the trash. They were given the Polikarpov Po-2. The Po-2 was not a warplane. It was a training biplane, first designed in 1928. It was the Soviet equivalent of a Piper Cub or a Jenny. It was a crop duster. Its official nickname was the Kukuruznik, the corn duster. It was a biplane. In a world of sleek metal monoplanes, they were given a relic from the First World War. Its construction was an insult. The frame was made of wood. The skin was persining, a type of treated fabric, essentially plywood and canvas. The cockpit was open to the elements. It had no radio, it had no radar, it had no defensive armor. Its top speed was a pathetic 150 kilometers per hour, about 94 miles per hour. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 could fly 4 times faster. This was the plane the little girls were given. It was slow, it was fragile, it was a death trap. The male commanders who assigned it to them likely saw it as a symbolic gesture. They thought, let the girls play at war. They will fly this slow, safe plane far behind the lines, and they will be out of our hair. They had just accidentally created the most effective psychological weapon of the war. They had handed the witches their broomsticks. The women, in their freezing, muddy barracks at Engels, looked at this canvas-in-wood sewing machine, as they called it. They did not see an insult. They saw a plane. And they began to master it. They trained 12, 14, 16 hours a day. They learned to fly it in the pitch black of the Russian winter. They learned to navigate by map and stopwatch because it had no modern instruments. They learned to fix its simple, sputtering engine with their bare hands, hands that were soon cracked and bleeding from the cold in the grease. And in May of 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, 40 all-female crews, 40 plywood planes, flew to the South Front. The German logic was about to meet the unthinkable. The 588th Regiment, now on the front lines, was a joke. A bad joke. To the German Luftwaffe, a force that had conquered Europe, this new enemy was not just inferior, it was an insult. A flight of Mi-109s landing after a mission would pass these plywood coffins on their way to the hangars and laugh. This was the logic of 1942. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav was a masterpiece of engineering. A 1,400 horsepower liquid-cooled engine, a top speed of over 400 miles per hour, a pressurized armored cockpit, a battery of 20mm cannons that could shred an American B-17. It was a high-tech metal predator. It was the X variable, speed,
armor, firepower. The Polikarpov Po-2 was the Y variable. It was an anomaly. It was an antique. To understand how the witches won, you must first do what the Germans did and deconstruct their weapon. You must analyze the sewing machine. Let's do the engineering. First, the construction. The Po-2 was not made of duralumin or steel. The entire airframe was a simple box truss built from pine and ash wood. Just wood. The kind of wood you would use to build a kitchen chair. This wooden frame was then covered, not in metal, but in percal. This is a type of treated doped fabric, like canvas, stretched tight and painted. This was the skin of the aircraft. The implication of this was immediate and terrifying. The Germans, like all modern air forces, used tracer rounds. A single incendiary bullet from a German fighter would not just puncture a Po-2, it would ignite it. The entire aircraft, the wood, the fabric, the glue, would vaporize in seconds. The women knew this. They called their planes the plywood coffin, or the crematorium on wings. There was no armor plate. There was no protection. The only thing between the 20-year-old pilot and a 20-millimeter cannon shell was a half-inch of painted fabric and a splinter of pine. Second, the engine. The Messerschmitt had a V12 liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz. It roared like a monster. The Po-2 had a Shvetsov M11. This was a 5-cylinder radial engine that was, by all accounts, a piece of agricultural equipment. It produced a pathetic 110 horsepower. For perspective, a modern 2025 Honda Civic has more horsepower. The Mi-109 had 12 times more. The M11 engine did not roar. It had a distinctive, sputtering put-put-put sound. It sounded exactly like a tractor, or a sewing machine. This was the nickname that stuck, the sewing machine. It was a simple, reliable engine. You could fix it with a hammer and a wrench. But it was also loud, and its sound was unforgettable. This sound, as we will see, would become a key part of the psychological terror. Third, the performance. This is the most crucial part of the entire equation. This is where the plane's logic becomes so absurd it bends back on itself. The top speed of the Po-2 was 94 miles per hour, 150 kilometers per hour. Let's be clear, a high-performance German car could go that fast. The Mi-109's landing speed was faster than the Po-2's top speed. And its stall speed, the absolute slowest it could fly before it simply fell out of the sky, was a mere 40 miles per hour. You could drive a car faster on a highway. This weakness was the central defining secret of the Po-2. It was so slow, so primitive, that it was unfightable. We will see this paradox in detail later, but for now, the Germans just saw a target so slow it was beneath contempt.
Fourth, the cockpit. The cockpit was not a cockpit. It was two open holes in the fuselage, one behind the other. The pilot sat in the back. The navigator sat in the front. There was no heat. There was no pressurization. There was no sealed canopy. The women flew in the dead of the Russian winter at 30 degrees below zero in an open, flying box. The wind was a physical object, a block of ice traveling at 90 miles per hour, hitting them in the face for hours. Their goggles would freeze, solid. Their faces, which they caked in thick, greasy Vaseline, would become numb, senseless masks. Frostbite was not a risk. It was a daily certainty. How did they communicate? There was no radio. There was no intercom. They shouted. They used hand signals. They passed notes, like in high school. The navigator would write a course correction on a piece of paper and pass it back to the pilot. This was, by any measure, primitive, brutalizing, and insane. Sixth, the armament. This is where the insult becomes a horror. The Po-2 was a training plane. It was never designed to carry bombs. It had no bomb bay. So the Soviet mechanics, with crude ingenuity, simply bolted light-duty bomb racks under the wings. These racks could carry about 300 kilograms, or 600 pounds of bombs. They could carry 2 large bombs or a cluster of smaller ones. But this wasn't the main weapon. The navigator in the front seat was the real weapon system. For smaller anti-personnel fragmentation bombs, she would hold them on her lap. Let that sink in. The navigator, Katya Ryoba, would take off with a half-dozen small 25-pound bombs sitting on her knees between her feet. These were often simple, modified artillery shells, highly unstable. When they reached the target, she would tap the pilot, Nadezhda, on the shoulder. Nadezhda would bank the plane. Katya would then unbuckle, stand up in her seat, and lean out of the open cockpit into the 90-mile-per-hour sub-zero wind. She would look down, estimate the target, pull the pin with her teeth or her freezing fingers, and manually, by hand, drop the bomb on the German soldiers below. This was not a 20th century weapon. This was a 14th century weapon. It was a rock dropped from a castle wall. It was the most primitive, personal, and terrifying form of aerial warfare imaginable. And finally, the parachutes. The women of the 588th flew without parachutes. This was not a choice. It was an order. The official reason was simple: to save weight. The 44 pounds of a parachute was 44 pounds less of bombs. The Polikarpov was so underpowered that every single ounce mattered. But the women knew the real reason. They knew the unofficial truth. The truth was that parachutes were valuable. They were expensive. They were given to the real pilots, the men in the real metal fighters. The plywood plane, the Kukuruznik, was considered by the high command to be more valuable than the woman flying it. The calculus was simple. If you are hit by a tracer round, you are a column of fire. A parachute is useless. If you are hit by flak, the plywood and fabric will disintegrate. A parachute is useless. The women, in their dark, grim humor, knew the truth. They had 2 options if they were hit: burn to death or be pulverized on impact. There was no escape. This was the weapon of the night witches. It was not a plane. It was an insult. A canvas and wood, slow-moving, unarmored, open-air, hand-thrown death trap. The Germans had a high-tech industrial scalpel. The Soviets had given these little girls a stone axe. The Germans laughed. They had just watched a 20-year-old girl climb into a flying coffin. They were about to find out what that coffin could do in the dark. The 588th Regiment arrived at the front in June 1942. The German soldiers, when they first saw this cluster of canvas biplanes parked near the front lines, laughed. They laughed. This was the old reality in action. The German pilots Men like the ace Gerhard Barkhorn would see them and shake their heads in disbelief. What is this? A flying club? This was the first mistake the Germans made. The second was surviving the first night. The 588th had a unique set of limitations. Their flying coffin was a tinderbox. It was unarmored, and it was embarrassingly slow. To fly it in the daytime was not war, it was suicide. A single German Messerschmitt would see it, dive on it, and it would cease to exist in a puff of fabric and flame. So, the women of the 588th made their first and most important tactical decision. They would become creatures of the night. They owned the darkness. The sun was their enemy. The moon was their confidant. They took the insult of their posting, night harassment, and they turned it into a deadly art form. But this created a new problem. How does a night bomber survive? The Germans had invented night fighting. They had a massive, complex, and high-tech system to defeat it. Their logic was built on three pillars: searchlights, batteries of massive 200-centimeter Flakscheinwerfer that could pin a B-17 at 10,000 feet, Flak, batteries of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, radar-guided and deadly, night fighters, German Me-110s and Junkers 88s equipped with their own airborne radar, specifically designed to hunt bombers in the dark. This was the system the Po-2 was supposed to challenge, a plywood plane against a wall of German electronic warfare. It was, once again, a joke. And this is where the genius of the witches was born. They looked at this invincible system and they found a loophole based on the physics of their insulting aircraft. The problem, they realized, was sound. The Po-2's sewing machine engine was primitive, but it was loud. That put-put-put could be heard for miles, giving the German sound detectors and flak batteries ample warning. So the women invented a tactic that would become their legend, a tactic so simple, so terrifying, and so effective, it would break the German mind. They called it the silent glide. Here is how it worked. A crew, a pilot and her navigator, would approach the target not at low altitude, but high, maybe a mile up. They would fly towards the target, the put-put-put of their engine announcing their arrival. The German searchlights would snap on. The flak guns would begin to range them. The Germans were ready. They were waiting. And then, the Po-2 would do the unthinkable. The pilot, Nadezhda Popova, would pull the throttle and kill the engine. The put-put-put would vanish, and there would be silence. For the German soldiers on the ground, this was the moment the terror began. 1 second, there was a target. The next, nothing. Just the cold night sky. The searchlights waved, frantically, hunting for a plane that had simply disappeared. But it hadn't disappeared. It was gliding. The Po-2, this primitive trainer, this crop duster, had a glide ratio almost as good as a modern-day hang glider. It could float. And in that total, unnatural silence, the plane would drift over the target. The only sound it made was the sound we heard in the hook, the faint, eerie whoosh of wind over the fabric wings, the sound of a broomstick. The navigator, Katya Ryabova, would be leaning over the side in the dark, looking down. No bomb sight, no computer, just her eyes, her map, and her stopwatch. She'd wait, wait, wait. Now, she would tap the pilot and by hand, she would drop the bombs. The bombs would whistle down, the first sound the Germans heard after the whoosh.
and the explosion would tear the camp apart.
But here is the genius. The German guns, the searchlights, they all reacted to the explosion. They pointed their beams to the source of the bombs. But the plane wasn't there. The pilot, Popova, was already 500 meters away, still in her silent glide. Only after the bombs hit, after the camp was in chaos, would she shove the stick forward, dive the plane, and restart the engine with a deafening roar. By the time the searchlights figured out where the engine sound was, she was gone. This was the Night Witch. This was not war. This was a ghost story. It was psychological torture. The German soldiers were veterans. They were hard men. They were not afraid of bombs. They were afraid of the whisper. They were afraid of the silence. They would sit in their bunkers listening to that put-put-put, tensing up, waiting for it to stop. And when it did, they knew the ghost was overhead. This tactic destroyed morale. It denied the Germans their most basic human need, sleep. The witches did not fly bombing runs. They flew harassment missions. Their goal was to make the German front line a living hell. And they were relentless. A male pilot in a real bomber, like an Il-4, would fly one mission per night. It was complex, dangerous, and required massive refueling and rearming. The witches, in their simple plywood planes, would do 10. The plane was so light it could be refueled in minutes. The bombs were so small they were loaded by hand by the all-female ground crews. A pilot and navigator would take off, fly 20 minutes, drop their bombs, fly 20 minutes back. And as they landed, their ground crew, a 19-year-old girl with a wrench, would be waiting. They would refuel, rearm, and the crew would take off again, sometimes before the first bombs had even stopped echoing. They would do this 8, 10, sometimes 12 times in a single winter night. They perfected the pack hunt. They would fly in wolf packs of 3. The first 2 planes would go in loud. They were the decoys. They would attract all the searchlights, all the flak. It was a terrifying light show. And while the entire German defense was distracted by the decoys, the third plane, the Ghost, would kill her engine and glide in, unnoticed, to hit the real target. And what happened when the Germans did get a lock? Here, the insult of the Po-2 became its final paradoxical defense. The flak. The German 88mm flak guns were masterpieces. They were designed to hit fast, high-altitude bombers. The gun's fuses were timed for a target moving at 300 miles per hour. The Po-2 was moving at 80. The German gunners could not hit them. Their computers, their training, their instincts, all were wrong. They would fire and the shell would explode in front of the witch, who was still plodding along, too slow for their calculations. The night fighters. This is the most absurd part of all. On several occasions, the Luftwaffe sent up their elite Me-109s to hunt the witches. The German ace, in his 400-mile-per-hour Predator, would spot the sewing machine. He would dive on it, and he would fly right past it. He was moving too fast. His stall speed was 120 miles per hour. The Po-2's top speed was 94. The Messerschmitt literally could not slow down enough to get a firing solution. If he tried, his own plane would fall out of the sky. It was like a hawk trying to catch a mosquito. And when they were hit, when a lucky machine gun burst from the ground did hit them, it didn't matter. In a metal plane, a bullet hits hydraulic lines, electrical wires, or stress-bearing metal. It's a critical failure. In the Po-2, a bullet just made a hole. It went through the fabric on one side and out the other. It hit air. They would fly back home, land, and count the holes. Nadezhda Popova, in her memoir, recalls landing one night and counting 42 holes. in the wings, in the fuselage, even in her map. Her all-female ground crew simply ran out with glue and fabric patches. They patched the plane like a pair of old jeans. The next night, Popova was flying it again. This insulting plywood plane was not fragile. It was, in fact, the most survivable, resilient, and terrifying aircraft on the front. The insult had become a system. The little girls had become a plague. And the Germans were no longer laughing. They were terrified. But the Po-2, the plywood coffin, was only half of the weapon. The other half was the woman flying it. And the Germans, in their tactical analysis, made one final, fatal error of logic. They assumed they were fighting soldiers. They were wrong. They were fighting people. To understand how the witches broke the German mind, you must understand how they lived. What happened during the day? What was the mechanics of their life when they were not ghosts in the dark? The 588th Regiment was a complete, self-contained female world. In a war defined by masculinity, this was a profound anomaly. Their air base was not a base. It was a field, a muddy, frozen patch of dirt just a few miles behind the front lines, close enough that they could hear the artillery. Their barracks were not barracks. They were zemlonki, basic, lice-infested holes dug in the earth, covered with logs and mud. The women slept 15 to a room on rough-hewn wooden bunks. Their only heat came from a single burjuska stove, the same kind the citizens of Leningrad were using. A normal day for a night witch was lived in reverse. They were creatures of the night. That meant they slept during the day. But sleep was impossible. The roar of other male aircraft taking off, the thud of distant artillery, and the constant grinding work of the base meant sleep was a luxury. This was their routine. 10 a.m. Wake up. They would stumble out of their bunkers into the daylight they hated. They were already exhausted. 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Quote, study and maintain. This was not rest. This was grueling intellectual work. The navigators, girls who had been university math students just a year before, would gather over their maps. They had to plan the night's targets. This was not go to GPS coordinate X. This was fly 50 miles in the dark with no radio, find a specific crossroads that is blacked out, and hit a single house where a German general is rumored to be sleeping. They had to calculate wind speed, drift, fuel, and time, all by hand. A single error in their math meant flying into a German flak battery or getting lost and running out of fuel. Meanwhile, the pilots were with their ground crews. The ground crews were the unsung heroes. They were also 20-year-old women. They were the armorers, the mechanics, the refuelers. They lived in even worse conditions, often sleeping outside under the wings of the planes to guard them. They were the ones who, in the freezing cold, would have to rearm the planes. A 50-kilogram bomb is 110 pounds. They would lift these by hand 10, 12 times a night, their hands cracking open from the cold. Their most critical job, the sewing. When a witch came back like a sieve with 40 holes in her fabric skin, it was the ground crew who came out with the patches, the glue, and the industrial-sized needles. They were literally sewing the planes back together for the next flight. 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Quote, the old reality intervenes. This is the part the Germans could not understand. These women were not just soldiers. They were girls. In these 2 hours before the sun set, their other life would appear. They would sit on their bunks and embroider. They would use their navigation pencils to draw, not maps, but pictures of flowers on the bunker walls. They would get letters from home and weep, not for the war, but because a boyfriend hadn't written. Their commander, a formidable woman named Yevdosia Bershanskaya, actually encouraged this. She knew that to survive this, they had to remain human. Their most prized possession? A pencil. With it, they would paint their lips. They would draw a seam up the back of their leg to pretend they were wearing silk stockings instead of the rough, male-issue trousers they hated. They would sing. They would gather around a broken accordion and sing the old, sad Russian folk songs. This was the anomaly the Germans were facing, an enemy that, just hours before a deadly mission, was darning their socks and painting on imaginary stockings. 6 p.m., the mission. The sun would set, the songs would stop, and the girls would disappear. The witches would emerge. They would put on their flight gear. This was a ritual of pure survival. They were given men's uniforms, which were useless, so they hacked them. They wore men's long underwear, then their own uniform, and then on top of that, a special, padded, quilted telegraphic suit. They were so bulked up, so layered, that they could barely climb into the cockpit. The ground crews had to physically shove and lift them into their seats. Their faces? Caked in greasy, foul-smelling Vaseline to prevent their skin from freezing to the metal of the goggles. And their boots? They were given massive, size 12 male-issue boots. The women, with their size 6 feet, would stuff the toes with rags or with ripped-up pieces of their old civilian letters. This was the uniform of the Night Witch, not a sleek, leather-jacketed ace, but a bundled, waddling, greasy, and utterly determined figure.
The view from the ground. Now, let's look at this from the German perspective. For this, we must be specific. The German aces of Jagdgeschwader 52, the most successful fighter wing in history, were based in the same sector. Men like Gerhard Barkhorn, who had 301 victories. They knew the sky, and they hated this. In their memoirs, they wrote about it. They didn't call it war. They called it a nuisance, a plague. The frustration was not just psychological, it was tactical. The Germans were forced to invent entirely new tactics to deal with this inferior plane. They learned that the speed paradox made a standard attack impossible. So, they developed the loop tactic. A German ace in his ME-110 would have to spot the witch against the dark ground. He would have to pass her deliberately. Then he would climb, dive down, and come up from beneath at a slower speed, trying to hit her soft underbelly. This was a complex, high-skill, and incredibly dangerous maneuver to perform in the dark, all for a plywood trainer. The German aces, the Knights of the Sky, were forced to become exterminators, and they hated it. But the flak batteries, the ground troops, they were the ones who truly suffered. A German officer, captured at Stalingrad, was asked about the Po-2. His testimony, recorded in Soviet archives, is the verdict from the ground. He said, "We were not afraid of your real bombers. We heard them, we saw them, we could shoot them down, we were prepared." He continued, "But your quiet ones, they were different. We would be in our bunker, trying to sleep. We would hear put, put, put. We would all stop talking, stop breathing. We would listen for it to stop. And when it did," he paused. "When it did, we knew the Kaffeemühle, the coffee grinder, was overhead, and we did not know where. We would just wait." The silence was the weapon. We would rather have been shelled all night. It was the waiting. It drove us insane. This was the logic of the witches. They weren't just dropping bombs, they were dropping silence. And in this war of ghosts, the losses were intimate and they were total. The 588th Regiment flew 24,000 missions. 32 of their members were lost. This is a number, a statistic. But the mechanics of how they were lost, this is the final brutal piece of the equation. They had no parachutes. This was not a small detail. This was a sentence. When a witch was caught, it was not a dogfight. It was an execution. A German night fighter would pull up from below and fire a single 1-second burst of tracer rounds. This is what the ground crews and the other pilots would see. A witch, flying in the dark, would suddenly light up. The tracer rounds would ignite the 80-year-old pine. The percale fabric, caked in explosive dope paint, would vaporize. The plane would not fall. It would incinerate in the air. From the moment of the first hit, the two women in the cockpit had, by all accounts, less than 30 seconds. They were a torch falling from the sky. This was the price. And because there were no parachutes, there was no choice. The pilot's only, final desperate act was to try and aim the falling fireball at the German guns that had killed her. The other witches, flying nearby, would see this. They were forbidden to break formation. They were forbidden to cry on the radio. They didn't have one. They had to keep flying. They had to watch their friends, their roommate, the girl they just shared a song with, burn. They would return to base. They would land, and the ground crew would count. 9 planes out, 8 planes back. This was the mechanics of their loss. This is what happened to a pilot named Nina Rotova. On one mission, a German ace, Joseph Kochiuk, a man who had won his Iron Cross specifically for hunting them, caught their squadron. Nina's plane was hit. It lit up. The other pilots watched, helpless, as her plywood coffin burned. But the witches were not just victims. They were soldiers. They went back to base. They rearmed, and they went hunting. They went back to the same sector night after night until a few weeks later, another witch caught Kochiuk's plane on the ground, refueling. They dive-bombed his airfield until he was dead. This was their life, a life of sewing and singing, and then an hour later, a cold, dark war of physics and fire. They were not soldiers in the way the Germans understood. They were not aces in the way the men understood. They were a logical, terrifying, and utterly unbreakable anomaly. They were the variable that broke the entire equation.
The German soldier was a product of the most advanced military logic on Earth. He was trained to identify, analyze, and destroy. He understood the sound of an incoming shell, the silhouette of a T-34, and the engine note of a Sturmovik. But this whispering, this whoosh, this sound of a broomstick, it broke his logic. It was not war. It was witchcraft. And so in the winter of 1943, the German soldiers gave them their name. It was not a name given in respect. It was a name given in pure animal terror. They called them die Nachthexen, the night witches. The fear itself became a weapon more effective than any 50-kilogram bomb. The German High Command, a machine of pure logic, now had to deal with a superstition problem. Their soldiers were being psychologically shattered. They were not just being bombed, they were being hunted relentlessly by ghosts they could not see. We know this because of the German reaction. The first and most logical reaction was, hunt them down, kill them. The Luftwaffe assigned some of its best night fighter aces to the sector, men with dozens of kills, flying the newest
radar-equipped Messerschmitt M110s and Junkers Ju-8s. The result was a catastrophe for the Germans. This is the ultimate absurd and beautiful paradox of the Night Witches. It is the speed paradox. Let's put ourselves in the cockpit of Oberlieutenant Helmut Lent, a German night fighter ace. He sees a Po-2 on his radar, a slow-crawling target. He engages. He is flying a 400 miles per hour Ferrari. The witch is flying a 90-mile-per-hour lawnmower. The Oberlieutenant dives. He gets the Po-2 in his sights. He is closing in. But he is closing in too fast. He has 2 seconds to identify, aim, and fire before he overtakes the witch. If he fires his cannons, the recoil of the massive 30mm guns slows his plane down so much that he risks stalling. So he slows down. He lowers his flaps and tries to match the Po-2's pathetic speed. And his $500,000 Messerschmitt falls out of the sky. His stall speed, the minimum speed his high-performance wing needs to stay in the air, is over 120 miles per hour. The Po-2's maximum speed is 94. It was mathematically impossible for a modern German fighter to engage a Po-2 on its own terms. The hawk could not catch the mosquito. The witches learned this, and they used it. When a German fighter did get a lock, the witches had one final, brilliant tactical move. They would pull back on the stick, slow their plane down to 40 miles per hour, and simply drop into a side slip, falling like a leaf. The German ace in his metal torpedo would roar past, his guns firing into empty night, utterly baffled. The witch would then literally hide. She would drop down to treetop level, flying between the trees, and navigate her way home. The German pilots were furious. It was dishonorable. It was like trying to fight a mosquito with a broadsword. It was cheating. This brings us to the second German reaction. If you can't beat them, reward those who can. The German High Command, in an act that proves the effectiveness of the witches, made an official proclamation. Any German pilot who managed to shoot down one of these plywood Po-2s would be immediately awarded the Iron Cross, First Class.
Let's analyze this. The Iron Cross was Germany's highest military honor. It was the medal given for destroying a B-17 bomber, for sinking a destroyer, for capturing a bridge under heavy fire. And the Germans were offering it for shooting down a 1928 training plane. This was not a reward. This was a bounty. This was an admission of complete and total psychological defeat. It was the German logic machine officially announcing that this anomaly, this sewing machine, was one of the most valuable and terrifying targets on the entire Eastern Front. The witches just laughed and kept flying. The stories of their individual courage are what built the legend. Nadezhda Popova, the girl from our hook, on one mission she was flying back, her plane looking, as she said, like a sieve. She counted 42 holes. She had flown through a wall of German flak. She had no idea how the plane was still in the air. As she landed, she saw another Po-2 on the tarmac. The pilot, her face covered in blood, was struggling to get out. Popova ran over to help. The pilot, her face covered in blood, fell into her arms. It was her childhood friend. She was dead. Popova, in a cold, white rage, climbed back into her own, patched-up, 42-hole plane and ordered the ground crew to rearm it. "Where are you going?" they shouted. "You have flown your mission." "I am going back," she said. And she flew 7 more missions that night, hunting the flak battery that had killed her friend. This was not logic. This was vengeance. Then there was Maria Dolina, who was cornered by 6 German fighters. They tore her plane to shreds. Her navigator was killed. Her own legs were shattered by shrapnel. Her plane was on fire. By all logic, she was dead. She should have bailed out if she had a parachute, or crashed. Instead, she flew the burning plane 100 miles back to base, landed it, and saved the mission maps which were covered in her own blood. She refused to be carried to the hospital until she had delivered her report. The Germans, these men of logic, were not fighting a system. They were fighting this. The insult of the Po-2 had become the price of the Iron Cross. So let's look at the final scoreboard, the final verdict of this insane, brilliant anomaly. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the little girls who had been given the trash of the Air Force, flew for 1,100 consecutive nights, without a break. They flew over 24,000 combat missions. Let that number sink in. 24,000. That's 2,000 more missions than the entire U.S. 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, flew in its B-17s. The Witches flew more missions than any other single unit in the entire Second World War. From their slow plywood sewing machines, they dropped, by hand, over 3,000 tons of bombs. We must be clear, the tonnage was small. A B-17 could drop that in an afternoon. But that was not the point. The point was 24,000 paper cuts, 24,000 psychological breaks, 24,000 sleepless nights for the Wehrmacht. They destroyed, by their count, 17 river crossings, 46 ammunition depots, 86 enemy strongpoints, and one Iron Cross winning ace who made the mistake of trying to slow down. 32 of these women, these little girls, died in their plywood coffins, burned, pulverized, lost. 23 of them were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the absolute highest honor in the nation. This joke regiment became the most decorated, most celebrated, and most feared unit in the entire Soviet Air Force. When the war ended, Nadezhda Popova, the 21-year-old girl from our hook, was a 24-year-old combat veteran. She had flown 852 combat missions. The German logic machine, the high-tech, industrial marvel of the Luftwaffe, had been defeated. It had been defeated by an equation it could not solve. The equation was 1 part 1928 wood, 1 part 19th century canvas, and 1 part 20th century woman who had been told she did not belong. The Germans were right. It was witchcraft.